like to introduce Seb Chan. So Seb is the director and CEO of Acme, and because my notes have disappeared, sorry, Seb. He was appointed to the role in August 2022 and was previously a part of the team that transformed Acme into a multi-award-winning, multi-platform museum. He's currently the National President of the Australian Museums and Galleries Association. Prior to Acme, he led the digital renewal and transformation of the Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum in New York and the Powerhouse Museum's pioneering work in open access, mass collaboration, and digital experience during the 2000s. His work has won awards internationally in the museum, media, and design spaces. He also leads a parallel life in digital art, writing, and music. So please give it up for Seb Chan.
Digitisation was all about taking high-res photos of things. High-res then being like lower than the resolution of this screen. Now we talk about doing 3D scans. So digitisation creates the demand for open collections, or created the drive for it. Open collections, of course, mean that new forms of interpretation, like what things mean, become possible. So I've done a lot of work throughout the last decades in searching inside things, so both within text mining in the early 2000s, computer vision stuff too, so describing what is in stuff, and now also, of course, language translation, and of course that also means language modernisation. So the way people describe collections often goes back decades, and the terms we use to describe things change, obviously. Now, the basic principle in all of this is public domain should exist and does exist. Now, it's public domain. I'm not sure if Rebecca Giblin's spoken here yet. She's on tomorrow, I think. She's awesome. Public domain is not a universal thing in all jurisdictions, and of course not everything a museum has is out of copyright. So those games I was showing, those films I was showing, those are in copyright still. Open curation, different to open collections, means curators, the people who curate exhibitions, show their working, right? We all know what show your working means, but in the museum world, show your working is not an obvious thing. The humanities doesn't necessarily show its working in the same way the sciences do. This is super important for, of course, public trust, and expertise has been degraded by several decades of liberalism and also far right activism too, has diminished public trust. So expertise matters a lot, but of course transparency matters to allow the non-expert public to actually want to trust us, okay? And of course that's difficult, it's hard work, and it requires interpreters. So the things that curators write, the things that I write about stuff, the things that you write about code, are not understandable by most people. So translators matter. And raw information, of course, as we know, has been weaponised by the right and by authoritarian governments. Raw information, flooding the world with more information, creates noise which hides truth. Right? So we have to be careful with open curation that we're not just flooding the world with more noise. Open collections similarly. Open source, of course, in the museum world, we make stuff. We write things with code. Museums now are full of great interactive experiences. Well, great, maybe not always, but good interactive experiences. We outsource a lot of that software development, or work with people like some of you. And the client, like always, wants stability. They want things to last. They don't want maintenance costs, right? So you put a thing in a gallery, and I remember when I started at the Smithsonian, they were talking about doing a new permanent exhibition in one of their many museums. They were like, this has to last for 30 years. And every designer and software developer who came into those briefs was like, what? And what they actually meant was 30 years with no revisions, nothing. it would run on the box for 30 years, which means it's not plugged into the network, right, because huge security risks. So the shift in the last decade has been, of course, from things like processing and open kind of frameworks, of course, to now the dominance of Unity. We also rely on open kind of code kind of libraries, but I'll talk a little bit about that. So after all of that, you're like, why open? Why do I care as a director and CEO now about this? Of course, because I come from the software and design world, of course I care about it. And it's also, of course, you probably realise it's a political thing for me too, because everything is political. Why open still? Preserving is much easier when it is open. We enable use through this, and sometimes museums and libraries are not also the best person who can determine who might use a thing or how they might use it. Public value, of course, is very important, and it's vital for museums and galleries and libraries like mine, which run on taxpayers' money. So it's a better use of public funds, and of course this funds an ecosystem, and it's a less bad choice than a closed. So I'm going to go back in time 20 years now. So this is where I worked at the Powerhouse. I worked at the Powerhouse till 2011, so I was there for about a decade, and I was making stuff, right? I was making stuff that came up with this warning when you loaded the page. Some of us remember that, and made lots of websites. We made lots of stuff. We were like a team that made lots of things. Lots of fun things in Flash that weirdly still work anyway. And around 2005, I came across the first needs for doing open access stuff, right? So these were 2 books of many that were in the Powerhouse's collection, in their fashion collection. And within those books, all out of copyright. And students who were studying fashion design and textiles would come and look at these, and they were full of fabric swatches. So fabric swatches are a little bit like when you go buy carpets and stuff, you can get those little swatch books and stuff. That's what they were called, swatch books, right? So lots and lots of these patterns from, 1890s to 1910s. Of these amazing patterns, and students would come flick through these, and they would take photos of them and then go and make patterns like those. And of course, this was very difficult for the curator to come and get these out of the storeroom for the students to look at, and the students had to put on those little white gloves to flick through them, and every time they were flicked through, the pages would deteriorate more, and the works would be exposed to light for more time, which would mean their colours would fade, which would degrade the work. So in 2005, we launched a thing called the Electronic Swatch Book, which scanned thousands of these. And what we did in that was made an interface that allowed people to download these as TIFFs. And back then, that was quite a radical notion, that you would give away all of this stuff that was out of copyright, and it was really about making this usable by those students. That also saved the museum a lot of work. We had a colour search on this. One of our developers, one of my friends who was working there, made a very simple tool that broke each image up into a grid and then sampled bits of it to pull out the primary colours of each image. I'll come back to that because we reused that piece of code 10 years kind of later. We open sourced a lot of how this was done, and then this led to putting the entire museum's collection at that time on kind of the web, right? So what was nice about that was this sort of notion of exposing all the metadata. So the metadata is all this stuff like the text and also the things related, subject tagging, all of that sort of stuff. So this is 2005, 2008, an API was launched for it. Pretty early on, we had early success in the social media world as people started to use and find these sort of things. So this is a comb from the museum's collection. This is all this website's all gone now, but you can look at it on the Internet Archive, of course, in the Wayback Machine. And we were using a tool there from Reuters, Open to Calais, that was text mining the entities that were mentioned in each blob of text. So we could pull out the people, the places, all of that sort of stuff that now is much easier. And we had subject cataloguing, and we found one morning that someone had used the user tagging feature to connect to a URL. Now, it wasn't a spam URL, of course, there was that going on as well. And that article, when we clicked on that link, took us to one of the digitised newspapers in the National Library's collection, where someone had linked that image of the comb to the article from 1950 of the museum collecting that comb.
That's awesome.
Right?
Yeah.
So that was kind of amazing. And there were quite a lot of examples of that. And this newspaper search now, of course, is part of what is called Trove. And if the federal government doesn't continue to fund Trove, things like this won't happen. So please support the National Library. So what's exciting about this was it opened up the way the museum thought about knowledge to the opportunities that come from opening that up to other people and building the interfaces to connect people on the internet to the stuff that is never shown in a public museum, because a very small percentage of any collection is put on exhibition. So it made us start to think about how we might also connect the museum in other ways to the world beyond. 2009, we worked with a firm called Mob Labs in Sydney. We just released a whole bunch of historic images of Sydney on Flickr with a CC0 license. These were out of copyright images, and Flickr had that early feature around geo kind of location. So we started to geolocate all of these scanned images, historic images. The iPhone had just also launched, and early AR tools had become launched, and Mob Labs worked with one of those AR tools called LayAR back then, and allowed you to navigate the photo archive whilst you were standing in front of the building with your camera on your phone. Kind of obvious nowadays. Back then it was kind of magic, kind of clunky magic, but still. But you could be in front of the QVB and then see the photo of the QVB 100 years prior. Kind of nice. But again began to show that there was opportunities once you opened access to things and created additional metadata for them. It created new ways of using and browsing all of this historic material that would otherwise never be seen. So 2011, I got hired by the Smithsonian and moved to this museum in New York. This is in Carnegie's old mansion house. So Carnegie was one of the Gilded Age industrialist barons, I guess. Super wealthy, put most of his wealth towards public libraries, but also did some union busting things during his time, so good and bad things. Cooper Hewitt was in his house. So it's part of the Smithsonian. So the Smithsonian is this very large, federally financed American museums, mostly on the Washington Mall, the Air and Space Museum, etc. You would have seen them in many films. Cooper Hewitt, New York, Upper East Side, full of amazing stuff. Mostly hadn't been digitised. Lots of porcelain animals, lots of posters, lots of products, weird things like this. That was a cage for your pet cricket. What? Yeah, kind of cool, right? So anyway, there were nerds back then who collected weird things, yeah, right? Anyway, The mascot for my then team, I was the Director of Digital and Emerging Media during this rebuild of that museum. The mascot for my team became this fabulous creature that became a GIF, cat and kitten, as if in the act of spanking was the description. Animates beautifully. It's slightly naughty and provocative. Cooper Hewitt was very small. So at any time, a very small amount of the collection, even with this massive redevelopment, was ever going to be put on show. So that's a tiny amount of that amazing collection. Now, when the Cooper Hewitt collection was first pulled together by the Hewitt sisters, some early 20th century women who were really pioneers in collecting practice then, they collected things from around the world and invited people in to copy them. Explicitly in to copy them. So it was about obtaining things from Europe and inspiring American women, predominantly, to build their craft skills by copying the masterworks of Europe. So this was about open access in a physical form, right? So that image of these women copying the collection informed a lot of how we thought about things for the following 4 years. So when I arrived, the museum had just begun a massive redevelopment, pulling apart Carnegie's old building and rebuilding it by hand in its original form. So when I started, there were about 10,000 works on kind of line. When I left, there were about 100,000 works online. Digitising the collection became the primary thing that drove much of what we implemented later. And remember what I said about collections being images of stuff, but then the descriptive stuff, the metadata about things. Most of those works, before digitisation, were on the website like this. Print, 1901. Now, when you have 100,000 prints, and they're all like that, how do you know which print is which? Like, you literally don't. And so we put some text up on here that would explain what was going on. So this object is resting in our storage facility. We're not sure who kind of made this, because we literally didn't. So that's a problem, right? And obviously photographing that work, even just photographing that work, allows someone to separate that from another print that says print 1901. So the very first set of work was putting all this stuff up on the web as it happened. My colleagues Aaron kind of Straub-Cope and Michael Walter did a huge amount of work on making all of this stuff that we had available in the most accessible form possible on the web, right? So early forms of this had different ways of presenting it. We did stuff like this, where we were showing the last 3 things that were photographed, this sort of stuff, right? We started to do, and this goes back, we reused that piece of code that was written for the Swatch book and evolved that so then we could implement a colour-based search, right? So navigating that collection by colour was at that point a pretty radical thing. It's now very common in museum collections, inspired by this work. So you could do things like this. All the things that are in the shade of the dark kind of green, and you could find a vase, the iPod Nano and this chair. You could also navigate that metadata in new ways and say, show us all the things that the museum collected in 1987. Show me all the people connected to things. Connect to the Wikipedia bio of that person, because if we know this person has this metadata about it, we can probably find the corresponding Wikipedia biography for that person, meaning that the staff don't need to waste time writing another biography for that person, right? So that was also part of this. This was a museum that had about 75 full-time staff and a technology team, including myself, of about 4 people. And that was because it was redeveloping a huge amount of stuff. But what we could also do when we started to give these things persistent identifiers on the internet, we could link them to other things. So we could say, the Cooper Hewitt knows about these people, the Powerhouse does too, so let's connect those 2 people up and let's navigate between those two. So we could do that with stuff, and you could see the things that the Cooper Hewitt had, the same things as the Powerhouse had, right? And there's a whole other talk about what that shows, which is that museums collect a lot of the same kind of stuff, and there's lots of the same Aeron office kind of chair in pretty much all designed museum collections, and on Amazon where you can buy them as well. Anyway, what if you could connect all those things up? So the idea there in rebuilding the building then was when everything was digitised, which of course would happen during that time, could you change the way the building worked for you as a visitor? So we built all this on top of APIs and this very simple model. This was what we used. This was done by Katie Shelley, one of the team who was a designer. She built this very simple pyramid to explain to donors and the staff what the hell we were doing, which was everything the museum did ran through the web, the public web. And that was super important. And it created this notion of the possibility of the museum as an interface itself. So when you visit the physical museum, what we were trying to do was to create this sense of you using the physical space much as you would use an interface through a screen, right? And it was an access to both the physical stuff but also the digitised stuff. I'm going to skip that next one. But of course, we would need to change the way people thought. So you're coming into that old house, right, that looks like an old house, but it was this amazing digital experience full of all this stuff that you probably didn't know about. How would we change that perception the moment you walked in the door? And how would you bring friction into that experience to slow people down? So when I was designing a lot of things around web experiences, it was about reducing friction. But of course, in physical spaces like conferences here, friction is a good thing because it slows people down and encourages people to speak to each other. Right? If you optimise things to reduce friction, you lose the grit of life and existence, and that matters. So we made this magic wand thing. It was a bit like a transit pass or a library card for a museum, and it had the initial form by the designers who worked on this initially. This was the initial concept art, was give everyone a pen. When you came to the design museum, what if you got a magic stylus that made you a kind of designer? So in 2015, when we launched it, it worked like this. You walked around the museum, you had this stylus that you took, you could collect things at one end, you could dock that with these interactive tables, you could explore the collection, you could be inspired and draw furniture and all sorts of other stuff, and you would be sent things from the collection that related to the designs you were drawing. And of course, you could save those and take those home as 3D models as well. Super cool. Designed a museum making people designers. There was this. So the museum also had this amazing wallpaper collection, right? So wallpapers, much like that swatch book, lots of these little strips. And of course, the wallpaper collection is about seeing what a room would feel like being surrounded by that pattern. And of course, you can't really do that with this little strip. However, you can when they are digitised. And Rick Grafe of the American Graphic kind of Design Association had this great quote in this article on the Cooper Hewitt just before I joined. You got this wallpaper collection? Like, what the hell, really? What are you going to do with that? Of course, you can do some cool things when it is, of course, digitised. You can allow people to create their own wallpapers and learn how wallpapers are made out of repeating patterns. That's kind of cool, and you can see how crazy things get as people draw lots of stuff, including kids. But you can also load historic wallpaper patterns you have digitised and create how a room would feel being surrounded by those patterns. So digitisation makes these new forms of access possible. Now, all of these wallpapers are pretty much out of copyright too, so that was kind of cool. And people spent a mountain of time here designing wallpapers. This is one of the things that's still running at the Cooper Hewitt now, like 10 years later. People did amazing stuff, right? Like super amazing stuff. Anyway, Of course, it was really social, it was lots of fun, it was great, and people experienced what historic wallpapers were like, as well as learning about how wallpapers were made mathematically in terms of repeating patterns and all of that. People collected a bunch of stuff, got used heaps, it won lots of awards. Fine. Biggest thing, the average age of the visitor dropped, right? So these historic museums, usually full of people who are older, who know what's in kind of them, now being exposed to people who didn't know, who could learn from them in different ways. So the other stuff that was going on then that I was doing was acquiring software and source code as part of the National Design Collection. So the Cooper Hewitt just announced last week that they've set up a digital design department within the museum's curatorial division. What I'm going to show you now were the first things that museum collected that joined that collection. So me and my team with Aaron Cope, he and I acquired the first app in the Smithsonian's collection, and it was this app that was done for the iPad by a studio called Bloom in 2011. So the first iPad, this was an app that was made for iOS 5, and it was updated for iOS 6 as well. This was a music player app that visualised your collection of music as a series of planetary bodies, right? So you had the artist as a sun, the albums as planets, and the tracks as moons. And the orbits were based on the length of the tracks, right? Kind of cool, right? Simple idea. Didn't work by the time we acquired it because iOS changed and it's fragile. And Bloom went out of business, as most startups did. So we acquired from Bloom the non-working source code. And it's important that it didn't work. And we worked with Bloom and their lawyers and the Smithsonian's lawyers to open source the source code as well, right? And we released the source code on GitHub as part of preserving the work. So this is a piece, this is something the museum is in quotes acquiring and then giving out. And it's open sourced on GitHub. And what that meant was you could go through the changes that the developers made, and the object had versions. And this showed, and this was super important, this was like acquiring a chair with the process of making the chair and all the sketches of the chairs that failed before it. So for me, acquiring the versioned code was a philosophical piece too, about saying future designers are going to need to know the choices that were made because of the limitations of the iPad in 2011, or actually 2010. So, and of course, you know, it's a museum, right? So to preserve this, GitHub's not the best place to preserve things, shock horror. If you want to preserve this for a long, long time, you print it out on archival paper in a font, OCR font from the late 1960s, so very small amounts of computing power can decode that in the future. And it was digital object 001, right? Super cool. In this archival box, and you know, it was kind of, you know, it was amusing at the time too. Anyway, and people were like, what did you acquire? Like, what actually did you acquire? And of course, as I just said, the underlying source code was about showing the possibilities for future exhibitions. And we released all this on the documentation. The metadata contained all of this discussion about it, and also what we call the curatorial file. So this was a means to, as I was saying, to reveal the choices designers made. Designers, as developers as well, we don't make choices in a vacuum. We make choices because of the context, the politics and the context of the period. And of course, this allows us to figure out the affordances of the iPad as a medium back back then. This is Ben Cerveny, also known as Neb, talking about this a little later. Let me see if this works.
The idea that Planetary was visualizing a collection of music as a finite set of things is already nostalgic. And the way that now people relate to music is as a stream, an infinite oncoming stream of possibilities that they're moving through. And that was actually part of our planned evolution for the way Planetary would unfold, was that eventually we wanted to include a universe of music which was much larger than the sort of solar systems that were created by the individual artists in the collection. The idea of a high-resolution touchscreen that was at one's disposal for the browsing of media was still a science fiction. This was the very first. iPad 1 was a very science fiction experience for people. The idea that there was this window into digital media that they could pick up and, viscerally interact with. And so we really wanted to, sort of, in a way, Planetary was part of the completion of that science fiction story. I mean, what is it you're supposed to see on this, all of the science fiction programs we've seen previous to the introduction of the iPad, the thing you were looking at when you, picked up your little tablet that had a display on it was some sort of interplanetary sort of navigational system.
One of the other designers, Tal Bacardin, who's now at Square, finally got the version running on a virtual machine, which was great. And 2020, a developer in Sydney got onto the GitHub repo and managed to remaster it and preserve it by making a new version of it, which is now free on the app kind of store. This was only possible because we released the code and an open kind of license that code. And there was a lot of discussion in 2018 and 19 in the digital preservation world that this experiment in open kind of sourcing software for preservation purposes had failed because no one had managed to rebuild it. A year later, someone did. So that's kind of cool. Now, it's important to realise it's not the solution for all of the things, but it's a nice proof that sometimes trusting the community allows these unexpected things to happen. The other thing we did was, of course, we were rebuilding the building. So for the first time in a long time, the building had nothing in it for like a week. And this was at a time when LiDAR scanners were kind of big, but they were available. And so we got a team to come and LiDAR scan the building and release it as a 3D model and a point cloud file that you can still download now, and again open kind of license. So this is the thing about the scanning of the building.
Today we're taking a 3D scan of the mansion of the Cooper Hewitt Museum. The first step was to scan the interior of the museum. We scanned every stairwell, every room on the inside. We then moved to the outside to scan the exterior walls. We linked those together, and now today, scanning the rooftop so that we can join the roof to the exterior, to the interior to create a single model. The way we do that is we take millions of measurements by using a LiDAR scanner. This casts a laser off of a spinning mirror. When it hits the object, it bounces back, measures the distance, and then we can import this data into the computer. From that, we look at it as a point cloud, just millions of dots. We then create a mesh in the computer, which is sort of like a wireframe. And then we take a camera, we take hundreds of pictures, we map those pictures onto the mesh, and now we have a textured model that we can look at from any direction, and it looks just like the real thing. There's so many cool things you can do with a 3D model like this. You can take a virtual tour in your computer. You can examine all the historic architectural details. You can create 3D prints using a 3D printer. You can use it to make a video game and have zombies and aliens running through the halls of the Cooper Hewitt. An exhibition designer who's planning a show at the Cooper Hewitt might want to actually plan their exhibit. There's so much you can do with a 3D model like this, and it's so awesome that it's free for download.
So there's a lot of ideas about the notion of a designed museum being open in as many ways as possible. The Cooper Hewitt redesigned logo and typeface, which launched in 2014 as well, was open sourced too. So it became a real philosophy in the museum's brand and experience and reality. So it was this big piece around all of these designed practices coming kind of together. In 2015, I moved back to Melbourne and we did this process again, right? So what you can go up and see now in the museum is some of those ideas iterated further. But I'm working with a different set of stuff now. So this is your Museum of Screw to Culture, and in terms of the collection, that means moving image archives, video art, video games. And very early on, we released, as you would expect, all of the collection metadata as CC0 license. So this was about 2016, I think. And instantly, we worked with students at our MIT to do some data visualizations of the representation in the collection. So we started to have people revealing new stories about the things we collected. So we were collecting historically many more documentaries about male creatives than female identifying creatives. We had different biases in experimental film. We could see new ways, we saw new ways of looking at the collection as a whole. We have an API, and I think Simon Loeffler from the software development team spoke last year about that. The API does what an API does. Don't need to explain that. And we've been integrating all these experiments into our design work. So this is what matters now for us. So this sort of sense of human curation, and I think as more AI tools are released daily, GPT-4 came out today, I think. These things, human curation really matters, because I think sorting through the mess of stuff needs our own biases that are legible to us to build trust, right? So very early on, we did a lot of stuff, those same kind of things, the text mining, video mining things that we were doing with the Powerhouse in the early 2000s, with some of the things from the collection. So this is Google's tool from 2017 running over some of the collection. And you can think about how much better this would be now. So 2017's tools were pretty blunt. 2023's tools have much more precision, but you can see the challenges you're going to have in identifying things in some of this historic footage. Because of the grain. So when we are digitising contemporary things, that's fine. But when we're digitising historic things with scratches and glitches, some of these computer vision tools don't work so well with it. We did some experiments, of course, with Clip, where we were generating fictional descriptions. So remember back to that Cooper Hewitt print where there was no metadata. So we started doing that with things in the collection now to generate descriptions based on stuff that we have that hasn't had time for staff to write. Captioning, again, lots of things we've been experimenting with there. Where things go wrong, right? We married at Clint Hunt. Like, what the hell is that? Anyway. Of course, transcription tools now supercharged. This is from 2018. Yeah. Who knew, right? Anyway, there is a concern in the museum world, of course, that what is happening when we move away from collection-specific knowledge to this data-centric view, and this is where I would usually talk about bias in these tools, trying to get data sets, language models, and these kinds of things. But it really does reveal within my world lots of issues around skills. So the other things that have changed in my museum now, everything is in copyright. So that's hard. There's no quotation exception within Australian law yet. Rebecca, I'm sure, will talk a bit about that. Of course, ICIP, or First Nations IAP, really matters, and it's not as simple as things are in or out of copyright. Copyright and rights may exist and be collectively owned within a community. There are also moral rights, and if you haven't checked out spawning.ai, that's a very exciting project around artists and creators opting out of training on images and works. Open kind of data is now used by machines more than it is by humans, right? So we know that, but we haven't thought through what that actually means. See also for First Nations. And of course that works out in the training models most explicitly, but in lots of other things too. So when you come up and visit, which I hope kind of you do in the next couple of days, this is the kind of experience you will now get. So you'll get given a lens. You don't get given a pen, you get given a lens, right? And like at Cooper Hewitt, you can collect all of the things. You can collect all the things you make. But differently to Cooper Hewitt, you take the lens home. And what happens there within our Museum of Screeder Culture is we connect you to things that are not in our exhibitions and not in our collections. So the purpose of the museum here has moved from showing you things within the museum's collection to showing you things that you might be interested in because our curators chose them beyond the museum's collection. So that's a slight philosophical and semantic shift. So the idea is that the museum becomes a place that inspires you to go further in this regard. So I think I'm gonna end in a second. Let's see how many slides I've got left. So the big question now as a director and CEO is, what are the literacies that my staff now need to work with technology? I'm in a museum of screed culture. I'm in a museum that collects and explores visual effects, that explores film, that explores video games. What are the literacies my curators need to make sense of the world that the tools people in this room are making don't understand? They don't understand it at all. They don't have the technical literacies to distinguish them from magic. And I think that is a problem. And I think that that's something that needs a lot of work between technology communities and the humanities. I'm going to skip the next slide because it's not relevant. Let's see what happens. Yeah, we know this too. And as I said at the start, this is a problem. And this is one in terms of open access that I've seen happen over the last 20 years. And where the Powerhouse did early work in open access, the Powerhouse was not a museum many people thought of in the global sense in terms of museum collections. And as soon as the British Museum, the Metropolitan Museum and other museums that people know started to release their collections, it crowds out the smaller collections, the more niche collections. And that's something to be aware of too. And of course the web now, so many design decisions within museums are now based on analytics data, which is a very blunt tool for measuring value. Breadth wins out over depth, and this is a challenge too. So when we don't have shared kind of narratives about things, communities will create their own. Sometimes they will be good things, sometimes they will be ridiculous things, as you're well aware of. So for me, as now Director and CEO, Open is a strategy and it's a tool for catalytic change. And what that change creates is what we need to talk more about as a society. So thanks heaps.
Thank you very much, Seb. It was great to see what the museum space is doing with their open collections and really embracing everything that we have done within our open source community as well. On behalf of the team, I'd like to give you this small gift to say thank you. Thank you. And please give it up for Seb.